Hello, my name is Manuel. In this video, I'll be showing you how to develop this restaurant point of sale application. So this is an application that can be used by restaurants to manage their daily sales. Before we start developing, let's take a moment to see how the application works. So as you can see, we have different categories on our menu. There is the appetizer, the main course, the dessert, and beverage. And also, to complete an order, a waiter or a waitress selects any of these items from the menu. So let's say the person selects 3 of these, let's say 2 of these, three of these also, and lastly 2 of these. So there is something we would notice over here. So let's say there are currently 2 packs of this clam dip available in the kitchen now. So the application only allows you to order as much as what is available. All right, so this person can't select more than 2 items or 2 packs of this particular item. So this same experience is also available in this cart section. So this is the same item here, and as you can see, the user is restricted from selecting more than the maximum number of available items for that particular product. Now let's continue. To complete the order, you need to input the customer's name. So I'm just going to say Emmanuel, and then you select the table location now. Then you click on submit order. Also, this application is responsive. So this is an iPad, and let's check for a mobile phone. So usually this kind of application will be used mainly on a desktop or a tablet device. However, this is still responsive and can be used on a mobile phone of this size. Alright, let's now go into the development of this application proper. So you can go ahead to create a blank canvas application, and after doing that, you should also go ahead to create these different screens. So we have a screen for the dashboard, a screen for the orders, a screen for the history, and another screen for bills. So the essence of creating all these screens is for us to be able to test the navigation of the application. And also, this is going to be the first of 2 or 3 series for this particular application. But for this first part, we are only going to be working with the dashboard screen. So another thing we need to do is to ensure that the scale to fit of the application is turned off, and then we can now go ahead to start creating the parts of this application. Okay, one more thing we need to check is the data sources connected to the application. We are going to be using 3 SharePoint lists. The first of them is the food catalog. So this is where we have all the food items, then the order list and the order details. So let's take a look at the food catalog first. So we have the item name, the category, the item description, the unit of measurement for that item, unit price, quantity, and the image link. So over here we have the order ID, the customer name, the status of the order, the number of items ordered, the seat number of the customer, subtotal, the tax, and the total price to be paid by that customer. So this is the list where we have all the items bought or items purchased stored. So we have the order ID, the item name, the quantity purchased, the unit price, and the total price for that item. Okay, now let's go ahead to create the navigation bar, which is also the header of the application. So for this component, we are going to name it the navigation component. and the width of this is going to be app.designWidth, and the height is going to be 70. Now we are going to add a container, a horizontal container inside this component. We are going to set the x and y axis of this to 0. Then the width is going to be parent.width, and the height would be parent.height. Okay, now for this container, we want to set the horizontal justification to space between. Now next, we are going to insert another container. So let's just add another horizontal container. The minimum height can be 0, and then we are going to turn off the flexible width. We are going to set the drop shadow to none, border radius to 0, and for the width, we are going to give it a width of 70. Okay, so we can just copy this and paste it inside the parent container, so we can have two containers at the extreme ends of the parent container. So another thing we need to do is to have a left and right padding of, let's say, 15. And for this first container, that's the container to the left, we are going to add an image control. You can set the flexible width, you can turn it on, and then also set this to stretch and then 0. And for the image, we are going to use this image for the logo of the restaurant. Now to the container on the right, we are going to insert an image control also. For this, we don't want it to occupy the entire height and width of its parent container, so we are setting the alignment to center. And for that, we want it to occupy 80% space of the parent height. Okay, so let's just leave it this way. And then for the image, we want to use the logged in users image, and then we are going to set the border radius to, let's just say, 90. Now within this parent container, we are going to add another horizontal container. Now we are setting the flexible width to none, that's we are turning it off, and the container is going to be at the center of its parent container. Now for the height, we can make it stretch. The minimum height should be 0. And then inside this horizontal container, we want to add a horizontal gallery. Minimum width, let's just set this to 0. And then for the template size, we want that to be parent.width divided by 4. Now let's remove all the controls inside the gallery. And for the height of the gallery, we want to set the minimum height to 0. Now within this gallery, we are going to add another container. So let's just add a horizontal container, and let's set the border radius to 0, drop shadow to none. For the width of that container, we are going to say parent.template width, and the height should be parent.template height. Now inside this container, we are going to add a button. We want the width of the button to be, okay, let's just turn on the flexible width property of the button, and then let's click on the parent container of the button and set the justification to center. And we are setting the x and y properties to 0. Now for the height of this button, we want it to be 35. And then we want to add an icon. We want the button to also have an icon. So for that, we are just going to set an icon in addition to what is there. And let's set the border radius of the button to 0. So before we continue, we need to add the navigation items of this application. So I'm just going to copy and paste the navigation items in the onStart property of the app. So we have this. So I'm going to run the onStart and then go back to the components. And within the components, I want to turn on the access app scope toggle so we can be able to access the collection we just created. So for the data source of this gallery is going to be that collection. Now we can now click on the button, and for the text of the button, we can say this item dot name, and for the icon, it will be this item dot icon. Another thing we need to do, I want us to make use of this green theme. So we are just going to click on that. Now, for this button also, we want the appearance to be dynamic. That's the type. So we are going to use this formula. Now, for the on start of the button, we are going to be using this formula too. Alright, another thing we need to do is to make the icon style dynamic also. So we click on the icon style property and then we input this formula. Another thing we want to do is to set the font color also to make it dynamic. So we'll be using that formula to achieve that. And let's just set the border radius to 8. Let's add the navigation to dashboard screen. But before we do that, we also need to insert some containers into the screen. So firstly, we are going to add a vertical container. We are going to set the X and Y properties to 0. We'll set the width to parent.width and the height to parent.height. Alright, let's name this container the main container. So just say container main. Now within this container, we are going to add 3 horizontal containers. Now for these 3 containers, let's just turn off their drop shadow property and set the border radius to 0. Now for the container at the top, this is going to be our header container. So we are going to turn off the flexible height and give it a height of 70. For this, we actually need the drop shadow radius to be drop shadow property to be turned on. Now for the middle container, we are going to name this. So let's name the first one the header container. So header. Now the middle container, we are going to name this the body. And the last one, we are going to name this mobile nav. And for the mobile nav, we are going to turn off the flexible height and give it a height of 50. Now for the mid container, we are going to turn on this wrap toggle also. Now let's insert the container the component we just created. Now for the navigation, we want it to have a flexible width. Let's set the minimum width to 0. Then the height should be parent.height. Alright, we need to create the navigation bar for mobile view. So let's just create it at once. So for the width of this, we are setting the width to app.designWidth. And we are setting the height to, let's say, 70. Okay, now within this, we are going to insert a horizontal container. And we are setting the X and Y properties to 0. We are setting the width to parent.width. And we are setting the height to parent.height. Now for the fill property, we are going to make use of this color, and then the border radius should be 0. Now within this container, we want to add a horizontal gallery. Let's delete all the controls within the gallery. Let's click on the parent container for that gallery and set the justification and alignment to center. And then for the gallery itself, we are going to set the alignment in the container to stretch and the minimum height to 0. And for the flexible width, we are going to turn it off and give it a width of 300. So we are going to set the template size to 75 and we are going to insert the container. Turning off drop shadow and border radius. We are setting the width to the template width. So parent.template width and the height to parent.template height. Okay, so now we can insert the button. And for that container, we are going to set the alignment and justification to center. We are going to ensure that this is set to 0. Now for the button, we want only the icon to be visible, so we are setting it to icon only. And let's just remove this text. And for the for the gallery, we are going to be using the same collection we used for the main gallery. Okay, so we've not turned on the access app scope. So now we We can access the collection in the onstart of the application. So the next thing we are going to do is to set the icon. So the icon is going to be this item dot icon. And for the button type, we are going to use this formula. And also for the icon style, we are going to use this formula too. And lastly, for the onSelect property of the button, just like we did in the first one, we are going to impute this also. There's something we still need to do. So we still need to add we are going to add the components to we did not rename the components. I'm going to rename this component mobile navigation. Now let's add the component we just created to this section of the application. Let's set the height to, or let's just do this, minimum height to 0. Alright, so for the visible property of that container, we are going to impute this. So now let's test. Now we are going to set the visible property of the main navigation to the inverse or the opposite of the mobile view navigation. We are setting this to false and we are setting this to true. Now we have this. So let's check for other sizes. So with that, we are done with the navigation of this application. So now within the body container, we want to add 2 vertical containers. We are going to name this first container the order catalog. And in the body container again, we are going to add the second vertical container. And we are going to name this the order details container. Okay, so let's just set the border radius and drop shadow to 0 and none respectively. Now for these 2 containers, we want the alignment to be stretched and then we want the minimum height to be parent.height. Now for the container on the left hand side, we want it to have a fill portion of 3. Then for that same container, we want to give it a left and right padding of 15 and a gap of 5. Now within this container, we are going to add 4 horizontal containers. 3, 4. Now for all these containers, we want their drop shadow to be none and the border radius to be 0. Now for the first container, we are going to name this order list header. Let's name the second container the order list. Let's name the third container category. Let's name the fourth container menu header. Okay, now so let's also add a gallery to the order catalog container. So we are going to add a vertical gallery. Okay, now we want to give this a fill portion of 13. Let's set the minimum height to 0 and minimum width to 0. Let's set the template size to 200. Okay, and let's also delete all the controls within the gallery. So before we continue with the items in the gallery, I want us to finish with the other part of the container. So for this first one, we are going to insert a text label. So we want it to be stretched. We can also turn on the flexible width. And then for the text property, we want that to be order list. Then we want the vertical alignment to be at the center. Let's also give it a left padding of 5. Now for the formatting of this, we are going to set the font size to 18. We want it to be bold. Now let's click on the parent container of this text label we just added and insert a button control inside that same container. So for this button, we want the type to be transparent and then we want the text property to be see all. Okay, let's go to this category container. So for this, we are going to set the minimum height to 40. And then within this, we are going to insert a horizontal container. A horizontal gallery. Now for that gallery, we want the minimum width to be 0. You can set the minimum height to be 0 also. And then for the template size, I'm just going to copy and paste this. Now there are some variables we still need to declare. So let's declare these variables in the onStart of the application. So let's just delete all the classic controls within the gallery and add a button. Now, so for this button, we want the width to be parent.width. So let's say -10. Then we are setting the X property to 5 and the Y property to 4. For the items property of this gallery, is going to be the collection of the categories. And now for the text property, this is going to be this item.value. Now another thing we want to do is to have a dynamic type, button type. So we are going to be using this formula for that. And we are going to set the border radius to this. And then for the category container, we want to use this fill property. Then we are going to set the border radius to 32. Now let's go to the next container. The next container is the menu header container. So for this, we want to set the minimum height to 40 also. And within that container, we are going to add a text control. And for the text control, the text property is going to be menu. And we are setting the vertical alignment to middle. We want the text font to be of size 18 and we want the font weight to be bold. Now for this gallery here, we are going to be using this formula. So we want to filter that list where the item category value equals this gallery dot selected. So this is why we need to name our controls. Let's name this gallery category. Now, inside the template of this gallery, we are going to add a vertical container. And for that container, we are going to set the width to this. And we are going to set the height to this. And one thing we need to do is to set the wrap count. So the wrap count of that gallery will be dynamic depending on the size of the device that's being used to access the application. So for that, let's just make use of this formula. So for this container, the X property would be 5 and the Y property, let's confirm that it is 0. Now inside this container, we are going to add 2 horizontal containers. Just copy this and paste. So before we do any other thing, let's set the drop shadow property and the border radius property and set the minimum height and width to 0. Now for the container at the top, we want it to have a fill portion of 2.5. Okay. Now within this container at the top, we are going to add an image control and a vertical container. Now for this image control, we want to set the height and width to 110. And for the parent container of that image control, we want to give it a left and top padding of 10. Now for the image control, let's give it a border radius of 16. And for all these containers we are adding, we don't want to have drop shadow. Now let's just add the image property for this image control. So this will be this item.image link. Okay, and we want it to have an image position of fill. Now remember we added a vertical container. Now within this container, we are going to be adding 3 text labels. Now for the text label in the middle, let's turn on the flexible height and give it a fill portion of 1.5. For the 3 text label controls, we want the alignment to be stretched. Now for the first one, the text property with this item.title. So we want it to be middle, each of them with a left padding of 5. Okay, so this will be this item description. And this last one will be this item.quantity. Alright, so for this last one, we also want it to be vertically aligned to the middle. And this one here, the middle one, we want it to be aligned to the top. For the title of the item, we want it to maintain a size of 14, but we want the font weight to be semi-bold. Now let's set the height of that control to be 20. For this, we're going to have a dynamic font size. So let's just copy and paste this there. Okay. Now for the quantity, first of all, we want it to have a font size of 11, and then we want the height of that control to be 20. Okay. Let's set the minimum width of this to 0. For this one, we can set the fill portion to, let's say, 1.4. Let's make this taller and maybe push this to the top. What if we have a height of 120? Okay, I think this is better. So I wanted this quantity to be on the same plane with the bottom of the images here. Okay, so another thing we need to do, we need to give this other catalog container, we want to give it a fill property of this. All right, and then for the font color of this item description, we want to give it, okay. Now for the font color of the title, we need to make it bolder. Yeah. Okay, now let's go to the bottom container within the template. So for this small container, we want to have 2 buttons and 2 text labels, and we want to have them alternatively, so that is, we would have 1 text label, then 1 button, another text label, and another button. Okay, so for the first text label, we want it to be stretched in the parent container. We also want the vertical alignment to be in the middle. Then we want to give it a font size of, let's give it a font size of 20 and a font weight of semi-bold. Now for the text label, we are going to use this. Alright, so for the button next to it, I want it to have a width and height of 28. And we want it to be aligned in the middle of the parent container. Alright, so we also don't want a text property. We want it to be just an icon, and let's give it a border radius of 90, and then we want to add an icon that is pointing downwards. And for this, we want to give it an icon style of secondary. Alright, now for the next text label, we also want it to be stretched in parent container and give it a vertical alignment of middle. We want it to have a width of 50, and we want this alignment to be at the center. We are going to maintain the size of 14, but we are going to give it a font weight of semi-bold. We are going to work on the text property of this. So for the next button, we want this to also have the same format as this one, or we can as well just copy and paste this button. Now we want this to be of type primary, and we want this to point upwards. We want this to have a flexible width. Okay, so let's start with this button here. For this button, I'm going to copy and paste the formula we would be using there. So what this button is doing is to help us add items to the cart. So let's check the formula and see what is happening there. So when you click on that button, if it is blank, that means if the item is not present in the collection, it creates the item newly in that collection. Otherwise, it now updates that collection, and the only thing we'll be updating in the collection is the number of items or the quantity we are purchasing. And then for the other button, we are going to be updating that item in the collection, and the only thing we'll be updating is the quantity. So as you can see, this would reduce the quantity by 1 to reduce the current quantity in the collection by 1. And also, if the quantity has been reduced to 0, it removes that item from the cart or from the collection. So for this text label in the middle, we will now display the quantity as it is being maybe increased or reduced in the collection. Now let's test. So when you click on it once, it increases by 1, so it keeps increasing like that, and then it also can also be reduced. Okay, so for this particular item here, you will notice that there's just one quantity of this in the data source, but we are able to select more than one quantity. So we are going to work on that now. So what we just want to do is to ensure that users do not select more than the available quantity we have for that particular item. So for this button, we are going to use this code in the display property. Okay, so I'm going to name this text label this. So if the current quantity in the data source equals 0, that is, if that item is no longer available, or the available quantity is less than or equal to the quantity that is to be purchased, then we want it to be disabled. Otherwise, we want it to be active. So let's now try this. We can see that the button is already disabled. So let's reduce it to 0. And then once it gets to 1, that's the same quantity with this item, the button becomes disabled. So we want to give this container here, that's the main template, the main container of the template. We can also name it menu item. So we want to give this menu item container a dynamic drop shadow. We also want to give it a dynamic fill property. Okay, so I think we should push this down a little bit. Let's give it a Y property of 2. Okay, so we can see the top of the container. And for this, let's give it a padding of 5. And for the item name text label, let's give it a left and right padding of 5 also. So let's come to this section of the screen, and for this section we are going to start by adding a text label. We want it to be stretched in the parent container. We want to give it a height of 40. We want the font size to be 18. We want to make this semi-bold. I want this to be aligned to the middle. I want to give it let's give the parent container a left padding, or a left and right padding of 10. Alright, for this, the text property is going to be customer information. Now, inside the parent container, we are going to add an input control, text input control. And we are going to add a combo box. Now for the parent container, we need to give it a gap of 10. Now for these two controls, let's give them a border radius of 8. We want them to have a border radius of 8. We also want them to have a height of 40. And we want them to have a font size of 14. Alright, for this text input control, let's give it a placeholder. Let's just say enter customer name. And then for this, this is going to be select table. So this helps us to know the table where the customer is seated. Select table. Alright, now for the items property, we just want it to table 1. Okay. Alright, next we are going to add a separator. So that's just going to be a line. For this line, we can just make it stretch across the parent container. You can set the minimum width to be 0, and then we want the height to just be 1. Okay, now for the color property, you just want to use a faint color. Okay, now we have this set, and let's not forget to name this. Let's name this customer name, txt customer name, and then for the combo box we want it to be customer table. So now we can go ahead to add the other parts of this. So let's just copy and paste this text label. So we are going to name this order details, and we are going to add a gallery. So let's add a vertical gallery. For the gallery, we are turning on the flexible height. We want to set the minimum height to 0, and we want the template size to be 80. Okay, before we delete the controls in the gallery, let's add the other controls we need to add for the parent container. That's this order details container. Copy, select the parent container and paste. Okay, I think we should just delete all the items in this gallery first. So we are going to add a vertical container inside the order details container. So let's add a vertical container inside there. And for this container, we are turning the flexible height on. We want to give it a minimum height of 60. We want to turn off the drop shadow and set the border radius to 0. And we want it to have a fill portion of 1.2. Now let's leave it at 1. Okay, now still inside this order details container, we want to add a button. Now for this button, first for the parent container, let's also give it a bottom padding of 10. All right, now for this button, we want it to have a height of 40, and we want it to be stretched within the parent container. Okay, we want it to also have a border radius of 8, and we want the text property to be submit order. Now within this container we added here, let's name it, let's first name this container order summary. Okay, now within this container we are going to add 3 horizontal containers. 1, 2, then 3. Okay, so we can highlight the 3 containers, set their drop shadow to none, border radius to 0. We want to have a minimum height of 0. Now for every of this container, we want to have 2 text labels, so one to the right and one to the left. So we have one text label and we have another text label. So for the text label at the left hand side, we want to have a fill portion of 2. So let's just turn on the flexible width of both. Okay, align to the middle. So for this, we can give it a fill portion of 2.5 and a left padding of 10. We also want to maintain this font size, but we want it to be semi bold, and we want the text property to be sub total. And then let's just copy, we'll get back to the other text label later. Let's just copy and paste this, and also this. So I think we will still need to make this parent container smaller by increasing the size of this gallery here. So first of all, let's rename this gallery. We want to name it gallery order details. Okay, we want this to have a fill portion of 4. Let's just remove the scroll bar for now. Now the items property of this gallery is going to be the collection we created from this part of the application. So that's going to be called order details. And inside the gallery, we want to add a container first, a vertical container. Okay, we want the width to be the template width, parent.template width, and we want the height to be the template height. Before we continue, let's turn this let's set this to none and this to 0. Now within this container, we are going to, okay, this should actually be a horizontal container. We are going to add an image control. Now for this image control, we want it to be aligned to the center of the parent container. We want it to have a height and width of 65. And the image property is going to be this item dot image. So let's just select an item from this gallery. Okay, now let's give it a border radius of 8 and let's set the image position to fill. I want to turn on the drop shadow of this other details container. Okay, so inside this container here, the highlighted container, I want to add a horizontal container now. I want to set the minimum height and width to 0. And inside that container we just added, we want to add 2 horizontal containers. So I'll just copy this container we just added and insert it there. So we have 1 and 2. That was a mistake. So this is supposed to be a vertical container because we want the items stacked above themselves. Alright, so this is how we want it to be. And for these containers, we want to turn off the drop shadow and set the border radius to none. Same with this also. Alright, now for this top container here, we want to have a text label and a button control. So let's add a text label and a button control. For the button control, we can just copy this and paste it in there. I'm going to remove the formula. So for this text label, let's stretch it and set the vertical alignment to 0. Let's give it a left padding of 5 and let's extend the flexible width also. You can set the minimum width to 0. Now we want the text property to be this item dot product name. So it's going to maintain this font size, but we want the font weight to be semi-bold. Now for this button we added, we want it to have a type of transparent, but we want the icon style to be the Smith icon. Then we want it to have a font color of red. Alright, so for the unselect property of this button, we are going to use this formula. And for the container at the bottom, we are going to be adding a couple of controls. We are going to copy all 3 of these and paste it inside this container. Let's just remove all of these first. We'll come back to the formulas later. We want to add 3 more text labels. Two and then 3. So we are going to move these 2 positions away. Okay, now this is going to be for this text label. We are just going to use this as a text property. So this would be the unit price of the selected item or product. And for this, we want this to be the multiplication sign. So we'll be using X, and then we want to reduce the width of this to 15. Okay, now for the next one, this is going to be the quantity, selected quantity for that product. That's quantity to be purchased by the customer. Okay. Now for the text labeled at the end here, this is simply going to be the multiplication of the unit price and the quantity to be purchased. So we want this to have a flexible width, and then we can set the minimum width to 0. And we want it to be aligned to the end of that text label, and let's give it a left padding of 10, or a right padding of 10 rather. And then we want it to have font size of 16. Let's add a padding to this container. Let's add a padding of 5. left and right padding of 5. Okay, now we want to replicate this feature within this carts gallery also. So to achieve that, let's see what we are using here. Okay, I'm just going to copy the formula and paste it within. So what we are simply doing here is that if the quantity to be purchased is less than the available quantity, then we want the button to be disabled. Otherwise, we want it to be active. And for this other button here, we are going to be using this formula. So what we are doing here is that we are subtracting from the quantity to be purchased whenever this button is clicked. So whenever this button is clicked, we are subtracting one item or one unit from the quantity of this item within this collection. And after reducing the quantity and it gets to 0, we want to remove the item from the gallery or from the collection completely. Now we want this total to have a font size of 16. These two should have font size of 16, but we want these ones to have or to maintain font sizes of 14. But we want to make the text a little less prominent than the total amount. All right, now let's name this text label this, because we'll be using it at the bottom here. So now we are going to, for this subtotal, we are going to use this formula. So we are summing all the total amount to be paid for each product. We are summing them up to get this. Let's make this semi-bold and let's align this to the end of the text label, and we can give it a left padding of 10. Let's name this subtotal text label. Let's name it this. Now for the tags, let's set the minimum height to 0, and also for this, let's set the minimum height to 0. Let's also set this minimum height to 0. Okay, so for the tags, we are going to be using this formula. Let's align it to the end and give it a right padding of 10 and also make it bold. Okay, so we are going to name this tax. We are going to name it tax label, and then for the total amount to be paid, we are going to use this formula. It's simply the addition of the subtotal and the tax. So as we did for the first two, we are setting the font weight to semi-bold, and we want the alignment to be at the end, and we want it to have a right padding of 10. So that way we've been able to create this part. So we need to rename this to order summary. So another thing we need to do is to now work on this gallery here. So we need to add a gallery into this container. We're adding a horizontal gallery. All right, let's first delete all the controls within the gallery, the minimum height and minimum width to 0, and then we want it to have a dynamic template size. So I'm just going to copy and paste this formula, and now within this gallery we are going to add a horizontal container first. Ensure that the x and y properties are 0, and then for the width we want it to be the template width. So parent.template width, and the height should be parent.template height. We want the border radius to be 8, and we are going to maintain this light drop shadow. We want the x-axis to be 5 and the y property to be at the center of the gallery. So for that, we are just going to copy and paste this. And for the height of the gallery, we actually want it to contain 90% of the template height. And for the width, we want it to also contain 90%, or let's say 95% of the template width. We want this container to have a fill property of white. Now within this container, we want to add a vertical container, and within that parent container, let's also add a text label. So we would have a text label to the right and a vertical container to the left. let's give the parent container a left and right padding of 10. And for the container we added inside, we want it to be stretched within the container, the parent container. Let's give it a minimum height of 0 and minimum width of 0. And we want the fill portion to be 5. And for the text label, we would also need to set the minimum width to 0 and turn on the flexible width. This can be at the center, top center, and then let's give it a top padding of, let's say, 5 for now. Okay, so before we continue with this, let's save an item to our SharePoint list, so we would have data to display within this other details section of the application. So let's set this to none and set this to 0. So for us to be able to submit an order, so we are saying for all the items in this collection, we want to patch those items to the order details. So we'll be patching or saving each of those items in the order details list. Now, of course, all of these items will be saved as a new item in the list, and not also forgetting that all these items are coming from just a particular or a single order. So we want to have a single order ID for all these items in order for us to be able to track them within the SharePoint list. So to get a unique ID for all these items, we are going to be using this grid function, and then we'll be saving that grid inside a local variable. So once we get that, we are going to save that into this local variable, and for all the items purchased, for each of these items that is to be purchased, each of them would now have this generated grid as their order ID. So for the other part of the formula that we'll be using, we need to initiate another local variable. So we want to get the total number of items a customer wants to purchase. So for example, for this first item here, the customer is purchasing 3 of it. Then for this one, for this one, for this one. So that means the total to be purchased here is 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so let's check. All right, so as you can see, we have 6 of these items. Okay, so we can run these first 2 functions concurrently. So we are going to add the concurrent function to this, comma. So next, we want to update the available quantity in the product catalog. So for that, we are going to use this function. So for all the items in the order details collection, we want to subtract the purchased quantity from the available quantity in that product catalog. So with this, we can save a record. Now the next thing we will just do is to clear these controls. We want to clear the collection first. We also want to reset the customer name and customer table controls also. So let's save this record. Okay, so now that we've saved a record, we should be able to have something to display inside this order list gallery here. So for this text label, this is going to be this item.id. Okay, we've not added the data source, so this is going to be order details. So this is now item.id. And for this control here, for this container, we are going to be adding 3 text labels. So we have 1, 2, 3. Now each of them, we want to set their minimum height to 0 and want to stretch them within the container. Okay, so the first one is going to be this item.title. This should be order list, not order details. Order list. For this, we are going to have this. I want it to be aligned to the middle. And then for the last one, let's turn off the flexible height and give it a height of 20. And we want it to have a border radius of, let's say, 16. And let's give it a font size of 11 and a font weight of semi-bold, and we are going to give it a left padding of 10. So this text label is meant for the status of this of the order. So for the field property, we are going to make use of a dynamic field property. We are going to set the font color to white, and then the text property is going to be this item dot order status dot value. Okay, so when an item or when an order is submitted, it's assigned a default status of order confirmed. So for this, we want it to have a vertical alignment of middle, and we want it to, let's assign, or let's give it a font size of 16 and a font weight of semi-bold. And for this, let's align it to the top. Okay, all right, now for the parent container, we want to give it a bottom padding of 10. Okay, so another thing we need to do is to add a spinner. So let's create a spinner container, a spinner component rather. So we are going to give this a width of app.designWidth, and the height would be app.designHeight. So inside this, we are going to let's add a vertical container, and we are going to give it a x and y property of 0. Then the width should be parent.width, while the height should be parent.height. Now let's add a spinner control. We want it to be at the center of the parent container. So we click on the parent container and set the vertical and horizontal alignments to the center and the middle. So inside the parent container, we are going to add a text label. You can just give it let's stretch it and then set the vertical alignment to the middle. So you can just say loading. Let's initiate a global variable inside the onSelect property of that button. So we are going to call this set spinner to true, set GBL spinner to false. Alright, we are going to add the spinner component to the dashboard screen. You click on the dashboard screen and you add the component we just created. We need to give the container here a fill property of white, and also ensure that the drop shadow is none and the border radius is false. Alright, so we want the visible property of this to be GBL spinner, and in the onStart of the application, we can also set the spinner to true and false as we did for the onSelect of that button. So set this to false and here to true. We want this to be disabled until all these controls have been filled with the required information. So for the display property of that, I'm just going to copy and paste this. Okay, this should be customer table. All right, so let's say Grace table 1. You can now submit this order. We want the fill portion of this to be 3.2. We can add or turn on the navigation or show navigation and have this instead. Let's remove this set to none. Okay, so you can decide to have the navigation there, or you can as well remove it completely. Okay, so for the free portion of this order catalog container, we are going to make it dynamic, and also for the fill portion of this order details container, we are also going to be using these two. There's something we still need to do for this. Yeah. Okay, so this way we can view all the items here. Okay, we can't see these components. Set this to Y. This bottom container, let's set the fill portion to 1.2. And then one more thing, we need to I want to have the same font color for these items also. Alright, so with this we have come to the end of this video. Kindly subscribe to my YouTube channel and also like this video and share it as well. Alright, see you in my next video. Bye for now.